We haven't eaten in 3 days, please, the girl whispered, her voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the howling Chicago wind. On that night, the city wasn't just cold, it was lethal. A polar vortex had descended like a white shroud, turning the streets of the Loop into frozen canyons, where the air itself felt like shattered glass against the skin. Elias Thorne, a man who believed he held the world in his hands, was about to discover how little he actually knew. Watch this story until the very end, because what starts as a simple act of charity will uncover a secret that could destroy an empire. If this story touches your heart, please give it a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe to the channel to support my work. I am counting on you. The wind off Lake Michigan didn't just blow, it screamed. It carried the scent of frozen salt and the metallic tang of exhaust, swirling through the narrow alleyways where the only sign of life was the rhythmic chugging of industrial vents. To the people living in the gleaming glass towers above, that steam was a byproduct of luxury. To those huddled on the sidewalk, it was the only thing keeping their blood from turning to ice. Chicago was a city of two worlds, separated by walls of wealth so thick they had become invisible to those who built them. Elias Thorne was a man who lived behind those walls. At 48, he was the architect of Thorne Logistics, a global empire that moved the world's goods with the precision of a Swiss watch. He was a man of silence and iron-pressed suits, a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and quarterly yields. His life was a study in minimalism, a sprawling penthouse overlooking the frozen lake that felt more like a museum of high-end furniture than a home. There were no photographs on the walls, no stray socks on the floor, and certainly no warmth in the air. He walked through the city like a ghost, his bespoke leather shoes stepping over frozen puddles without ever losing their shine. People weren't humans to Elias. They were either assets to be managed or obstacles to be bypassed. He had become an expert at the 1,000-yard stare, a way of looking through the suffering of others as if they were nothing more than glitches in a perfectly coded system. But Elias wasn't born a machine. 10 years ago, the light in his world had been extinguished when his 7-year-old daughter Sarah died from a sudden aggressive illness. His marriage had disintegrated in the fallout, leaving him with nothing but a silver compass Sarah had given him for his birthday, a gift meant to help him always find his way home. Now he used work as a shield, burying himself in acquisitions and mergers so he wouldn't have to feel the hollow ache in his chest. That evening, Elias was leaving the Sterling, the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. He had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal, and the taste of expensive bourbon and dry-aged beef was still on his tongue. He stood under the heated awning of the restaurant, waiting for his town car to pull around. The golden light from the restaurant's windows spilled onto the sidewalk, creating a false sense of summer in the middle of the Arctic blast. That was when he saw them. Huddled under a tattered, wind-whipped awning just a few feet away were two figures. They looked like a single mass of grey rags against the brickwork. It was a boy and a girl. The boy, who looked to be about 15, was curled protectively around a much smaller child. His hands were raw and cracked, the skin a frightening shade of purple from the exposure. He was trying to shield the girl with his own body, his thin denim jacket offering no more protection than a sheet of paper. The girl was small, perhaps 8 years old. Her skin was waxy and pale, her lips tinged with blue. But it was her eyes that stopped Elias in his tracks. They were bright, observant, and filled with a depth of weariness that no child should ever possess. She looked like a miniature version of a ghost, and in her arms, clutched tightly to her chest, was a small, dirt-smudged stuffed rabbit. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang in his chest, like a physical blow. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the silver compass. He had seen thousands of homeless people in his life, but he had never seen that rabbit. It was the same model, the exact same long-eared, velvet-nosed rabbit that Sarah had held in her final moments. "We haven't eaten in 3 days, and please," the girl whispered again. The boy, Caleb, tried to pull her back, his pride flaring even through the shivering. "Maya, don't. He doesn't care. Nobody cares." His voice was a jagged edge of anger and desperation. He looked at Elias with a fierce, protective glare, a young wolf guarding his cub. Elias stood frozen. His town car pulled up to the curb, the warm interior beckoning him. He could have just reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill, tossed it at them, and disappeared into the night. That was what a man like him was supposed to do. It was efficient. It solved the immediate problem without requiring any emotional investment. But as he looked at Maya, he didn't see a vagrant. He saw the same cadence in her voice that his daughter had. He saw the way she tilted her head, the way she clung to that rabbit as if it were the only anchor left in a drowning world. The CEO mask he had worn for a decade didn't just slip, it shattered. "Wait," Elias said, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. He turned away from his waiting car. "Sir?" his driver asked, stepping out to open the door. Elias didn't answer. He walked toward the children. Caleb flinched, pulling Maya closer, his eyes darting for an escape route that didn't exist in the frozen alley. "You're cold," Elias said. It was a stupid, obvious thing to say, but his brain was struggling to process the sudden rush of suppressed emotions. "And you're hungry." "We're fine," Caleb spat, though his teeth were chattering so hard it was a wonder they didn't break. Elias looked at Maya. She wasn't looking at his expensive coat or his gold watch. She was looking at his eyes, searching for something. "Come with me," Elias said. He didn't lead them toward the car. He turned around and marched them straight back toward the heavy, brass-trimmed doors of the Sterling. As they approached the entrance, the heavy glass doors swung open, and the warmth of the restaurant hit them like a physical wave. But standing in the doorway was Sterling Vance, the manager and namesake of the establishment. Vance was a man who lived for optics. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. To Vance, the restaurant wasn't a place for food. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a fortress against the unwashed masses of the city. "Mr. Thorne," Vance said, his smile widening as he saw Elias. But then his eyes dropped to the two shivering children standing behind the CEO. His expression shifted instantly to one of disgusted horror. "I am so sorry, sir. Are these people bothering you? I'll have security remove them immediately. We can't have this kind of element lingering at the entrance." Vance signaled to two large men in suits standing near the cloakroom. Caleb gripped Maya's hand, his body tensing for a fight he couldn't win. Elias stepped forward, his height and presence filling the doorway. "They aren't bothering me, Sterling. They are my guests." The silence that followed was heavy. Inside the restaurant, the clinking of crystal and the low hum of polite conversation seemed to falter. Men in $4,000 suits and women draped in silk turned their heads, their eyes widening at the sight of the two ragged children standing on the pristine marble floor. "I beg your pardon?" Vance stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Mr. Thorne, surely you're joking. This is a five-star establishment. We have a dress code. We have standards. Look at them. They're filthy. They'll ruin the atmosphere. I simply cannot allow it." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He leaned in close to Vance, his tone as cold as the wind outside. "Listen to me very carefully, Sterling. Thorne Logistics holds the master lease on this entire block. I don't just eat here. I own the ground you're standing on. If these children aren't seated at my private table in the next 60 seconds, with the best heaters you have and a menu in their hands, I will pull my corporate account. And then I will buy this building tomorrow morning just so I can be the one to hand you your pink slip by noon. Do I make myself clear?" Vance's face went from pale to a sickly shade of grey. He looked at the children, then back at the most powerful man in the room. He knew Elias Thorne didn't make idle threats. "Right this way, sir," Vance choked out, his voice trembling. The walk to the private booth at the back of the restaurant felt like a mile. Every eye in the room was on them. Maya shuffled along, her dirty sneakers leaving wet grey slush on the white carpet. She held her rabbit tighter, her eyes wide as she took in the glittering chandeliers and the towers of seafood on silver platters. Caleb walked with his head up, a mask of defiance covering the sheer terror in his eyes. He looked like a soldier walking into an ambush. They were seated in a plush, velvet-lined booth. Within moments, 3 waiters appeared, their faces masks of forced neutrality, as they draped thick, warm blankets around the children's shoulders. A silver bowl of warm water was brought out, and Elias watched as Caleb tentatively dipped his frozen fingers into it, a small gasp of pain escaping his lips as the blood began to flow again. "Order whatever you want," Elias said, his voice softening. "Everything on the menu. Don't worry about the cost." Maya looked at the menu, her small hands shaking so hard the paper rattled. She looked up at Elias. "Can I have bread? Just some bread?" Elias felt the lump in his throat grow. "You can have much more than bread, Maya." As the children began to eat, tearing into warm rolls with a desperation that was heartbreaking to witness, Elias sat across from them, his dinner long forgotten. He watched Maya, the way she carefully placed her stuffed rabbit on the seat next to her, giving it a small pat as if to reassure it. It was then that Elias noticed something. Hanging from a thick, industrial-grade cord around Caleb's neck was a heavy brass key. It was old, worn smooth by years of being touched, and it bore a very specific engraving on the head, a stylized T wrapped in a circle. Elias's blood ran cold. That wasn't just any key. It was a master key to a Thorn Logistics secure locker, the kind used only by senior foremen at his primary distribution hubs. "Caleb," Elias said, his voice low and urgent, "where did you get that key?" The boy stopped mid-bite, his eyes darting to the cord around his neck. He instinctively tucked the key under his shirt, his protective walls slamming back into place. "It's nothing. Just something my dad left." "Your father?" Elias pressed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What was his name?" Caleb hesitated, looking at Maya, who was now blissfully eating a bowl of thick potato soup. He looked back at Elias, his gaze hardening. "His name was Marcus Miller. He worked for you until you destroyed him." The name Marcus Miller didn't just hang in the air. It felt like a ghost had finally decided to speak. Elias felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind. It was the chill of a man realizing the foundation of his palace was built on the bones of those he had forgotten. He looked at Caleb, whose eyes were no longer those of a scared child, but of a judge delivering a sentence. Elias searched his memory, digging through years of balance sheets and corporate memos. The name Marcus Miller was buried deep, a flicker of a memory from a human resources report he'd glanced at while distracted by a merger in Singapore. But things were about to get much worse. Caleb leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous hiss that bypassed the expensive jazz playing over the restaurant's speakers. "My dad didn't just lose his job, Mr. Thorn. He was hunted. He found things. Things about the way your company was shipping ghost containers. He tried to talk to you, but you were too busy in your glass tower. So he talked to Julian Vane instead." Elias felt a jolt at the mention of Julian. Julian Vane wasn't just his chief operating officer, he was his closest friend. They had started Thorn Logistics together in a cramped garage 3 decades ago. When Elias's daughter Sarah died, it was Julian who stepped into the light while Elias retreated into the shadows of his own grief. Julian had been the one to handle the dirty work of the company, telling Elias to focus on his healing while he kept the engines running. He had trusted Julian with his life, and more importantly, with his legacy. "You're mistaken," Elias said, though his voice lacked its usual corporate steel. "Julian wouldn't... He's been with me since the beginning." Caleb let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded far too old for a 15-year-old. "That's what Dad thought too, until Julian had him blacklisted from every warehouse in the Midwest, until the police started showing up at our house with anonymous tips about stolen goods. We lost everything in 6 months, the house, the car, the food. Dad went to look for work in Indiana, promising he'd come back for us. That was 4 months ago. We haven't heard from him since." Maya, who had been quietly eating her soup, suddenly looked up. Her small blue-tinged hand reached out and touched Elias's sleeve. Her touch was incredibly light, like the flutter of a bird's wing, but it felt like an electric shock to Elias. "Is my daddy in your building?" she asked, her eyes wide with a hope so pure it was agonizing. "Did you find him?" Elias couldn't look at her. He felt the weight of the silver compass in his pocket, the one Sarah had given him to always find his way home. He realized with a sickening clarity that he had been lost for a very long time. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a captain who had gone below deck while his crew burned the ship. Before he could answer, the silence of their booth was shattered. His phone vibrated on the table. The caller ID flashed a name that now felt like a threat: Julian Vane. Elias stared at the phone. He didn't pick it up. He looked at the children, 2 broken pieces of a life he had inadvertently shattered. But this was only the beginning of the storm. "We're leaving," Elias said, standing up abruptly. Caleb stood up too, instantly defensive, pulling Maya behind him. "Where? Are you calling the cops?" "No," Elias said, his voice regaining its authority but with a new raw edge. "I'm taking you somewhere warm, somewhere safe. And then I'm going to find out if what you said is true." As they walked out of the Sterling Vance, the manager, watched them with a look of pure malice. He was already on his own phone, his eyes locked on the children's tattered clothes as if they were a stain he couldn't wait to scrub away. Elias ignored him, ushering the children into his town car. The leather seats were heated, and the interior smelled of expensive cedar and success. It was a world the children had never known, and as Maya sank into the seat, she let out a long, shuddering sigh, her eyes fluttering shut as the warmth finally began to seep into her bones. Elias drove them to the Peninsula, one of the city's most guarded hotels. He didn't take them to his penthouse, not yet. He needed a place where they could be invisible while he began to dig. He checked them into a suite under a pseudonym, ordering a mountain of room service and the softest clothes the hotel boutique could provide. As the children were finally ushered into a warm bath by a kind, elderly maid Elias had personally tipped $1,000 to ensure her discretion, Elias stood by the window of the suite. He looked out at the Chicago skyline, the twinkling lights of the city looking like cold, indifferent diamonds. He pulled out his phone and finally called Julian back. "Elias!" Julian's voice was boisterous, filled with the easy charisma that had made him the darling of the board of directors. "I heard you had quite the dinner at the Sterling. Sterling Vance called me, sounding like he'd seen a ghost. What's this about you bringing street kids into a closing dinner? People are talking, Elias. It's not a good look." Elias gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "Just a bit of charity, Julian." The girl reminded me of Sarah. There was a pause on the other end. A brief cold silence that lasted only a second before Julian's warm tone returned. "I understand, buddy. Really, I do. But you have to be careful. Those kinds of people, they're professional victims. They'll take you for everything you've got if you let them. Why don't you head home? I've got the board meeting prep ready for tomorrow. We're close to the finish line on the new automation rollout. I'll see you tomorrow, Julian," Elias said and hung up. He didn't go home. He waited until the children were asleep. He walked into their bedroom and saw them huddled together on the massive king-sized bed. Even in sleep they stayed close, as if afraid the world would rip them apart if they let go. Maya was still clutching the stuffed rabbit. Caleb's hand was draped over her, his fingers still resting near the brass key hanging from his neck. Elias leaned in, his heart pounding. He carefully lifted the key, trying not to wake the boy. He took a photo of the serial number engraved on the side. He went into the living room of the suite and opened his laptop. He bypassed the standard corporate portals, using a private administrative override he hadn't touched in years. He searched the employee archives for Marcus Miller. The file was there, but it was flagged. Terminated for cause, theft, and gross misconduct. The notes were signed by Julian Vane himself. But as Elias dug deeper into the metadata of the report, he saw something Julian hadn't expected anyone to look for. The report had been backdated. The theft had been reported 3 days after Marcus Miller had filed a formal internal whistleblower complaint regarding the Southside distribution hub. Elias felt a wave of nausea. The whistleblower complaint was missing from the main server, but the digital trail was still there, a ghost in the machine. Marcus had been reporting discrepancies in the inventory, millions of dollars worth of electronics and pharmaceuticals that were arriving at the hub but never leaving on Thorn trucks. But it wasn't just about the money. The reports mentioned safety violations, shuttered vents, disabled fire alarms, and workers being forced to stay in sub-zero temperatures to meet Julian's efficiency quotas. Elias sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He looked at the photo of the key on his phone. The serial number belonged to Locker 742 at the Southside hub, a locker that, according to the system, had been decommissioned and welded shut years ago. He realized then that the children weren't just a reminder of his daughter, they were the evidence of his own failure. He had built a kingdom of glass, but he had allowed a serpent to guard the gates. Suddenly, a soft sound came from the doorway. It was Caleb. He was standing there in an oversized hotel robe, looking small and fragile without his defensive posturing. "You found it, didn't you?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. Elias closed the laptop. "I found enough to know that your father was a brave man, Caleb. My dad told me that if anything happened to him, I had to keep that key safe," Caleb whispered, a tear finally escaping and rolling down his cheek. "He said it was the only thing that could stop the man in the pinstripe suit. He meant Julian, didn't he?" Elias stood up and walked over to the boy. He put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture he hadn't used in a decade. "Yes, Caleb. He meant Julian. But you're his friend," Caleb said, looking up at him with a mix of hope and terror. "Are you going to help him hide what he did, or are you going to help us?" Elias looked at the silver compass sitting on the table. For the first time in 10 years, the needle didn't feel like it was spinning aimlessly. It was pointing directly at the truth, no matter how much it was going to cost him. "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," Elias said, "but we have to move fast. Julian isn't going to wait for us to find him." As if on cue, the hotel room phone rang. It wasn't the front desk. It was an internal line. "Mr. Thorne," a voice said. It was one of his own private security team members. "We have a problem. There are 3 black SUVs pulling into the hotel garage. They aren't city police and they aren't ours. They're Julian Vane's private contractors. They're headed for the elevators." Elias's blood turned to ice. Julian didn't just know he was here. He was coming to finish what he started at the Southside hub. The walls of the elite world Elias had built were no longer a sanctuary. They were a cage. "Wake up, Maya," Elias said, his voice dropping into a command. "We have to go. Now." The elevator chime rang through the luxury suite like a countdown to an execution. Elias Thorne didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, the silver compass Sarah had given him heavy in his pocket, and gestured for Caleb and Maya to move. They didn't have time for a grand escape. They were caught in the gears of a machine that Elias himself had built, and now those gears were turning to crush them. The irony was a bitter pill. He had spent decades perfecting the security protocols of his empire, and now those very protocols were being used by Julian Vane to hunt him down. "We can't use the main elevators," Elias whispered, his voice low and urgent. He led them through a side door that opened into the service corridor. The smell of industrial cleaner and expensive laundry replaced the cedar scent of the suite. Maya clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. Caleb looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward every shadow. Elias realized then that for these children, the world had always been a series of narrow escapes and closed doors. They reached the service elevator just as the heavy thud of combat boots echoed from the main hallway. Julian hadn't sent suit-and-tie executives. He had sent extractors, men who specialized in making problems disappear quietly. The elevator doors groaned open, and Elias shoved the children inside, hitting the button for the basement garage. As the car descended, Elias felt a strange, terrifying sensation. It was the first time in 10 years he felt truly alive. The numbness that had been his only companion since Sarah's death was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. But the worst was yet to come. When they reached the garage, the air was frigid. The polar vortex was still howling outside, and the concrete walls of the parking structure seemed to vibrate with the force of the wind. Elias's town car was gone, likely intercepted or tracked. He looked at the rows of luxury vehicles, their chrome reflecting the dim fluorescent lights. He pulled a key fob from his pocket, pressing a button on a nondescript black SUV parked in a corner. It was a discretionary vehicle, unregistered to the company, kept for emergencies he never thought he'd face. "Get in," he commanded. As they sped out of the garage, a black SUV lurched from the shadows, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Julian's men weren't hiding anymore. They were in the middle of a citywide manhunt, and Elias Thorne, the king of Chicago logistics, was now the prey. Elias pushed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as they merged onto the empty, ice-slicked streets of the south side. "Where are we going?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking. He was looking out the back window, watching the distant headlights of their pursuers. "To the truth," Elias said. "We're going to Locker 742. The drive was a nightmare of skidding tires and blinding snow. The city looked different from down here, away from the glass towers of the Loop. The south side was a graveyard of rusted iron and shuttered dreams. This was where the efficiency Julian spoke of had its real impact. Every time Julian had cut costs to boost the quarterly dividends, a family down here had lost a heater, a meal, or a home. Elias felt a profound sense of shame. He had been so focused on the horizon that he had never looked at the ground beneath his feet. They arrived at the Southside Distribution Hub, a massive windowless monolith surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. To the world, this was a marvel of modern logistics. To Marcus Miller, it had been a prison. Elias used his master override at the gate. The heavy steel doors ground open, protesting the cold. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of silence. Row after row of towering shelves reached toward the ceiling, filled with crates and containers. The air was even colder inside, a stagnant, biting chill that smelled of old oil and dust. Maya shivered, her small frame rattling under the hotel robe. "It's scary here," she whispered. "It's okay, Maya," Elias said, though he didn't feel okay. He felt like he was walking into a tomb. They found Locker 742 in a decommissioned section of the hub, a place where the lights flickered, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of frost. The locker had been welded shut, just as the system had said, but the weld was sloppy, a rushed job intended to hide something rather than secure it. Elias didn't have tools, but he had the brass key hanging from Caleb's neck. He looked at the boy. "Your father didn't just leave you a key, Caleb. He left you a legacy." Elias used a heavy iron bar from a nearby pallet jack to pry at the welded seam. With a screech of tortured metal, the weld snapped. He inserted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Inside the locker was a single waterproof Pelican case. Elias pulled it out and opened it. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a stack of handwritten journals, a digital recorder, and a thick folder of manifests. Caleb reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the journals. "This is Dad's handwriting." Elias picked up the digital recorder and pressed play. The voice that came out was tired, gravelly, and filled with a desperate kind of courage. It was Marcus Miller. "If anyone is listening to this, it means I didn't make it back," the voice said. Maya let out a small, choked sob, burying her face in her stuffed rabbit. Elias felt his own eyes sting. "My name is Marcus Miller. I'm a foreman at Thorn South Hub. For 6 months, I've been tracking Julian Vane's shadow fleet. He's been diverting high-value shipments, medical supplies, tech, industrial parts, and selling them on the black market. But that's not the worst of it. To hide the theft, he's been falsifying safety reports. He's been cutting the power to the community heating grids we're supposed to maintain, just to save a few pennies on the overhead. People are freezing in their homes so he can buy another yacht. I tried to go to Elias Thorn, but Vane has him locked in a bubble of grief. If you find this, please, tell my kids I love them, and tell Thorn that his empire is rotting from the inside out." The recording ended with the sound of a heavy door opening and the distant shout of a security guard. Then silence. Elias sat on a cold crate, the recorder heavy in his hand. He looked at Caleb and Maya. The truth was worse than he had imagined. Julian wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who had exploited Elias's deepest pain to dismantle the company's soul. "He found things," Caleb whispered. "He found out why we were hungry." Elias stood up, a new kind of steel in his spine. He looked at his watch. The emergency board meeting was in 3 hours. Julian had called it to have Elias removed, claiming he was mentally unfit to lead. If Julian succeeded, the evidence in this locker would be destroyed, and Marcus Miller's name would remain a footnote in a history of theft and misconduct. "We have to go back," Elias said. "Back?" Caleb asked, his eyes wide. "They're looking for us. They'll kill us if we go back to the loop." Elias looked at the silver compass Sarah had given him. The needle was steady. He realized that home wasn't a penthouse or a glass office. Home was the place where you stood up for what was right. "They won't kill us, Caleb," Elias said, "because we aren't going to hide anymore. We're going to walk right through the front door." But the journey back was even more perilous. As they left the hub, the black SUV was waiting. This time, there were 3 of them. They didn't just follow, they began to ram the side of Elias's vehicle, trying to force him off the frozen road and into the icy waters of the Chicago River. Maya screamed as the glass of the rear window shattered. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was a businessman, not a stunt driver, but he was fueled by a decade of repressed fatherly love. He navigated the frozen labyrinth of the South Side with a desperation that defied the laws of physics. He managed to lose them in the dense, steaming alleys of the meatpacking district, but he knew it was only a matter of time. His phone rang again. It was a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of the boardroom on the 60th floor. Julian was already there, sitting at the head of the table, a smug smile on his face. The caption read, "Last chance, Elias. Give me the kids and the key, and I'll let you retire to a nice sanitarium. Don't make me do this the hard way." Elias deleted the text. He didn't look at the phone again. He looked at Maya, who was shivering in the back seat. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked. Maya looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering streetlights. "I'm cold, Elias, but I'm not scared anymore. My daddy said you were a good man. He said you just needed to wake up." Elias felt a tear finally break free, a warm track on his cold cheek. "I'm awake now, Maya. I promise. I'm finally awake." The turning point was no longer about survival. It was about a total, uncompromising confrontation. Elias knew he was risking everything, his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom. But as he drove toward the glowing towers of the loop, he realized he had already lost those things years ago. Today he was going to win back his soul. The board meeting was set for 9 a.m. The sun was beginning to rise over the frozen lake, a pale, weak light that offered no warmth. Elias pulled up to the Thorn Logistics headquarters. Security was tight, and he could see Julian's personal guards at every entrance. But Elias Thorn still had one advantage Julian didn't count on. He still had the hearts of the people who actually ran the building. He didn't go to the front. He went to the loading docks. He found the men who had worked under Marcus Miller, the men who had been silent out of fear. When they saw the CEO standing there with Marcus's children and the brass key, the fear vanished. It was replaced by a silent, simmering rage. The worst was indeed over. Now, it was time for justice. Watch what happens next, because the confrontation in the boardroom will change the city of Chicago forever. If you're still with me, comment justice and stay tuned for the final part of this incredible journey. You won't believe how it ends. The boardroom on the 60th floor was a cathedral of glass and ego, suspended in the grey, frozen sky of Chicago. Inside, the air was climate-controlled to a perfect 72 degrees, a stark contrast to the sub-zero reality of the streets below. Julian Vane sat at the head of the mahogany table, surrounded by the 12 members of the board. He looked like the picture of corporate stability, polished, calm, and utterly lethal. He was mid-sentence, his voice smooth as silk, as he explained why Elias Thorne, the man who had built this empire, needed to be forcibly removed for the sake of the shareholders. But Julian had forgotten one thing. He had built his defense on the assumption that Elias would play by the rules of the world they had created. He didn't expect Elias to bring the world he had ignored right into the heart of the sanctuary. The double oak doors swung open with a heavy thud that silenced the room. Julian didn't even turn around at first. He simply sighed, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Elias, I was hoping you'd come. We were just discussing your recent erratic behavior. It's better this way, really." Elias stepped into the room, but he didn't go to his usual seat. He walked to the center of the floor, and he wasn't alone. Caleb and Maya walked beside him, their presence a jarring anomaly in the room of bespoke suits and diamond cufflinks. Maya was still clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide but no longer darting with fear. Caleb stood tall, the brass key visible against his chest. Behind them, two of the building's most veteran security guards, men who had known Elias for 20 years, stood at the door, blocking Julian's private contractors from entering. Julian's smile faltered. His eyes darted to the children, and for a fleeting second a flash of pure, unadulterated panic crossed his face. "Elias, what is this? This is a professional meeting. Get these vagrants out of here. You're proving my point for me. You've lost your mind." "I haven't lost my mind, Julian," Elias said, his voice echoing with a resonance that seemed to vibrate the glass walls. "For the first time in 10 years, I've finally found it." Elias placed the Pelican case from locker 742 on the table. He didn't look at the board members. He looked directly at Julian. "You told me Marcus Miller was a thief. You told me he was a disgruntled employee who tried to sabotage our hubs. You used my grief as a blindfold so you could turn this company into a parasite." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a woman named Eleanor, who had been a friend of Elias's late wife, leaned forward. "Elias, what are you talking about? What is in that case?" "The truth about the Shadow Fleet," Elias said. He opened the case and pulled out the handwritten journals. He tossed one toward Eleanor, and the truth about why our Southside hub has been reporting efficiency gains while the surrounding neighborhood has been freezing to death. Julian laughed, though it sounded forced and hollow. "This is a fairy tale. You found some old notes from a fired worker and you think it means something?" "You're desperate, Elias. You're a broken man clinging to a ghost." Elias didn't argue. He reached into the case and pulled out the digital recorder. He hit play. The voice of Marcus Miller filled the room, tired, brave, and undeniable. As the recording detailed Julian's embezzlement and the intentional cutting of community resources, the atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't just corporate concern anymore. It was the realization that they were sitting in a room with a criminal. But Julian wasn't done. He stood up, his face contorting with rage. "Turn that off. It's a fabrication. Guards, remove them." Julian's private contractors tried to push past the men at the door, but the veteran guards didn't budge. They had heard the recording too. They knew the families in the South Side. One of them, a man named Joe, whose own brother had been laid off during Julian's restructuring, looked Julian in the eye and didn't move an inch. It was over. But the final blow didn't come from Elias. It came from Caleb. The boy stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a receipt from a local shelter where his father had spent his last night in Chicago before heading to Indiana. On the back, Marcus had scribbled a list of dates and container numbers. "My dad didn't just write journals," Caleb said, his voice steady. "He tracked the trucks. He knew which ones were yours, Mr. Vane. He saw you at the hub at midnight. He took photos. They're on a cloud drive. The password is the date I was born." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian sank back into his chair, the color draining from his face until he looked as waxy and pale as the children had been on the street. He looked at the board, searching for an ally, but he found only cold, hard stares. He had played the game of shadows for so long that he had forgotten what happened when someone finally turned on the lights. Elias looked at Julian, but he didn't feel the triumph he expected. He only felt a profound sadness for the years they had wasted. "Julian, the police are downstairs. I called them 20 minutes ago. They have the manifest from the locker. They have the digital trail." As the doors opened again, this time to admit 2 detectives from the Chicago Police Department, Julian didn't fight. He was escorted out in handcuffs, his pinstripe suit looking like a costume that no longer fit. The board members turned to Elias, their faces filled with a mixture of apology and expectation. "Elias," Eleanor said, standing up, "we had no idea. We'll fix this. We'll put you back in charge. We can announce a massive rebranding tomorrow. The stock will recover." Elias looked at the mahogany table, then out at the city below. He saw the steam rising from the vents in the alleyways. He saw the invisible walls he had spent his life building. Then he looked at Maya, who was watching him with those old observant eyes. "No," Elias said quietly. "I'm not coming back." The room erupted in whispers. "Elias, you can't be serious. Thorn Logistics is yours." "It hasn't been mine for a long time," Elias said. "I built this company to move things from one place to another, but I forgot that the most important things can't be shipped in a container. I'm resigning, effective immediately. I'm liquidating my shares to create a trust." "What kind of trust?" Eleanor asked. "One that builds something real," Elias said. The story didn't end that day in the boardroom. The ice of the polar vortex eventually began to crack, and the biting winds of Chicago softened into the gentle breeze of spring. The news of the Thorn Logistics scandal dominated the headlines for weeks, but the real story was happening far away from the cameras. 3 months later, a new building was inaugurated on the south side, on the very site where the old corrupt distribution hub had stood. It wasn't a warehouse. It was the Sarah Thorn Center. It was a massive, light-filled space that provided more than just shelter. It had legal clinics to fight for workers' rights, a medical wing, and a job placement program that focused on dignity over efficiency. But the most important part of the center was the garden. Elias Thorn sat on a stone bench in the center of that garden. He wasn't wearing a $4,000 suit. He was in a simple sweater and jeans, his face tanned and lined with a kind of peace that no amount of money could buy. He looked 10 years younger. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was a volunteer who spent his mornings teaching math to the kids in the after-school program. He heard the sound of laughter, real, bubbling laughter. Maya came running down the path, her school uniform slightly rumpled, her stuffed rabbit now sporting a new, clean ribbon around its neck. Caleb followed close behind, looking healthy and strong, his cracked hands fully healed. "Elias!" Maya shouted, jumping onto the bench next to him. "Look, I got an A on my history project." Elias smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I never doubted you for a second, Maya." Caleb sat on the other side of Elias, looking toward the entrance of the garden. A man was walking toward them, a man who walked with a slight limp but with his head held high. It was Marcus Miller. Elias's private investigators had found him in a hospital in Indianapolis, where he had been recovering from a workplace injury under a false name, afraid that Julian's men were still hunting him. Elias had paid for his treatment and brought him home. Marcus stopped in front of the bench. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at his children, then at the man who had saved them. He reached out and shook Elias's hand. "Thank you, Elias, for everything." "I should be thanking you, Marcus," Elias said. "You reminded me how to find my way home." As the sun began to set over Chicago, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out the silver compass Sarah had given him. He looked at it for a long moment, the needle pointing steady and true. Then he gently closed the lid and handed it to Caleb. "Keep this," Elias said, "to remember that no matter how cold the world gets, there's always a way back to the light." Elias watched the Miller family walk toward the center together. He stayed on the bench for a while longer, watching the shadows lengthen. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured by what you kept in a vault, but by what you were willing to give away to save a single soul. He had lost his empire, but he had found his family. And for the first time in a decade, the man who had everything finally had enough. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that it's never too late for a second chance, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your support allows me to keep bringing these stories of hope and justice to the world. I promise to be here for you every day with narratives that make life a little lighter. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.